What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and this title is not clickbait. Spider-Man dies. So this is the 8 deaths of Spider-Man. And for those of you guys who need a little bit of catch up, because it's been a while since we've done it, in effect, the demon entity Cyttorak struck a bargain with Doctor Strange that for some reason that hadn't really been explained up to that point in time, the two of them entered into a kind of contest where seemingly over a period of time, for some number of years, that Doctor Strange would face off against the children of Cyttorak. If any one of them successfully killed Doctor Strange permanently, it would allow Cyttorak to invade Earth. Now, most of you guys are aware of Cyttorak because he's the guy that gives Juggernaut his power. He's incredibly powerful. So literally, this game is the only thing that prevents the end of all things on Earth, because if Cyttorak were to show up on Earth, outside of the highest level reality warpers, and depending on how the story's written, nobody would be able to stop him. Well, when Doctor Doom took the power of Doctor Strange and kind of set the Marvel Universe on the path of one world under Doom, Doom basically had more important things to do. Quite literally. So he just passed this on to Spider-Man, and now Spider-Man fights as the champion of Earth against the children of Cyttorak. Each one of these kids has a power of their own, and these powers vary from super strength to super speed, the ability to manipulate dimensions, and so on and so forth. In the last video that we did, Syra had basically shown Spider-Man all the ways in which everybody that he had ever known would die, right? And seemingly everybody on Earth die in just a variety of ways. And so Spider-Man just kind of lost hope in what it meant to be a superhero and effectively walked away. And that's where this opens up, because Juggernaut, picking up on the fact that like the children of Cyttorak are showing up here during this contest, ends up leading the X-Men in the fight against the children of Cyttorak, even if only for a moment. Now, the X-Men do what they can, and they hold themselves pretty well. But keep in mind, this is a child of an astronomically powerful demon entity. And so that's the reason why, despite some incredibly powerful mutants who are here, Psylocke, Magic, Quentin Quire, also known as Kid Omega, some of these being Omega-level mutants, cannot quite keep this guy down. They just don't necessarily have the power to do it. But it all comes down to Juggernaut. Now, again, this story does kind of cook the books a little bit, if we're being honest with ourselves, but it's also a really cool fight between the two, because while this whole thing goes down, Cyttorak watches this fight unfold, and Cyttorak's kind of fascinated by this whole thing. Remember, Spider-Man's given up. The champion quit. So technically speaking, Cyttorak does have the right to invade if he chooses to. But seeing the conflict is more interesting than anything else, especially with Cain Marko just beating the crap out of his son. But at the same time, Cain Marko is getting the crap beat out of him. This is literally a battle of juggernauts, essentially. And so after that, Doctor Strange ends up going to visit Peter Parker, who's just kind of drinking a cup of coffee and doesn't really care about anything. And that's what's so wild about this, is because, remember, Peter's just sort of like, what's the point, right? I mean, an important distinction to understand here, Peter is not somehow like descended into depression, right? He's not just like sitting around all day moping, crying, listening to, I don't know, some sad emo music like Evanescence and just, writing in a journal about how terrible life is. That's not really what he's doing, right? He's just sort of like, I mean, what's the point, right? Like, who cares? Because from his perspective, the idea is like, sure, they save humanity from a threat and a worse threat comes along. So what's the point, right? I mean, why keep fighting this nonsensical battle? And on some level, Doctor Strange understands it, but that's not really the way the world works. I mean, sure, like the world presents you with challenges all the time. But for us as people, while those challenges can be exhausting, they can also be incredibly rewarding when they're overcome. And it's not as though Peter's hit with challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge nonstop 100% of the time. This situation is really an exception to the rule as opposed to the rule itself. He's inside his own head. He's gotten into his own head, so he can't really see the forest for the trees. He doesn't really realize that it's an exception to the rule and not the rule itself. And so he's just not thinking clearly, essentially. And so while all that goes on, you then switch over to Calyx, the brother of Syra, the last champion to fight Spider-Man, and the one that Spider-Man absolutely crushed. But as this fight is taking place between the two of them, suddenly Calyx starts to kind of change his physical appearance and almost sort of succumb to a power that's not his own. Now, here's where things get kind of wild here. Here's where things get murky. And I don't know what's going on. I mean, it is explained, right? It's basically something called a blight. We'll talk about that here in a second. But there's the diamond on his head, and his skin turns white. He looks like Sinister. right? Technically, Sinister does not have a diamond on his neck, but it looks like Sinister, right? Now, again, these are all things that he had anyway, right? Which is to say, he already had the diamond on his head. He already had the diamond on his neck, right? These things were already there. So I don't know if Marvel's toying with something here. Maybe I'm just sort of looking a little too deep into something that doesn't matter. I'm not really sure. But that's when you switch back over to the story that Doctor Strange tells Peter Parker, where he says, when I first encountered the Blight, it nearly destroyed me. I was younger then. The secrets of the universe were revealed to me, and I was filled with wonder and awe, but was still not ready for the cosmic energy known as the Blight. I studied it because that is who I am. But the more I learned, the more I realized that it was a threat to Earth and everything I hold dear. I tried to destroy it, but it was a wasted effort. The Blight is eternal. It is a force of nature, as inexorable as solar flares or death. It exists to extinguish life. If it were to perceive humanity, it would be our end. Now, here's the crazy thing about this. Marvel does this from time to time. They introduce like a new cosmic entity, or they change up some aspect of the Marvel cosmology to add in a new level of power that didn't exist before. A good example of this is like the Black Winter and Thor's hammer, right? For years and years and years, only the worthy could lift Thor's hammer. It didn't have to necessarily be a good guy. All a person had to do was be worthy, because the inscription said, whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. It never said anything about whosoever holds this hammer, if they be a good guy, shall possess the power of Thor. That was never part of the inscription, right? People just kind of tricked themselves into believing that over the years in Marvel Comics. But when it came to Jason Aaron's run and Donny Cates' runs, it introduced this idea that inside the hammer was a cosmic storm that had been tamed by Odin. And the storm trapped in the hammer was actually the determining factor of who got to wield the hammer and who didn't. But then it was also the same thing with the Black Winter, right? That at the beginning of Donny Cates' run, that Galactus shows up to Asgard unceremoniously, literally crashing into Asgard and saying like he needs Thor's help in order to defeat a greater foe, which turns out to be the Black Winter. And the same way that Galactus travels the cosmos and consumes planets, the Black Winter travels the multiverse and consumes universes. And it actually consumed the DC universe. Literally, it's the DC superheroes that were consumed by the Black Winter. It was kind of hilarious. But the bigger point here is this. The introduction of the Blight as this kind of antithesis to existence, it's not the first time that's happened. And in fact, one of the things that Doctor Strange says here is he says, I searched for a way to destroy the Blight. Through this reality and others, you cannot even begin to imagine there was only one option, the spell for the casket. I rejected that solution at first, but eventually I did the unthinkable. I made the bargain with Cyttorak that resulted in the Covenant. The casket is the only thing keeping the Blight from perceiving the earth and raining misery down upon us all. Now, again, this is another example of uncharted waters, right? The casket of Cyttorak is something that we just haven't seen before. We don't really know anything about it. So again, this is all new stuff. But Doctor Strange goes on and he says, the Blight seeks to prune life and does so through an affliction known as soul rot and endless torture where living things seek out the things they love the most and they destroy them. And he says, Peter, there are things worse than death. Soul rot and the chaos the Blight would wreak on Earth are among them. And the response of Peter is, look, I get what you're saying, man, but like, why does it matter, right? Because even if we defeat this Blight that you're talking about, something worse is going to come along. And that's where Doctor Strange is like, dude, you have to snap out of it, man. Like, dude, I get where you're at. I get that you're struggling, but we are all the captains of our own ship, right? Like, you are the guy who saves people. You're the guy who saves yourself. You need to save yourself here, right? I mean, that's a real life lesson, right? That is a real lesson to have here. And ultimately, Spider-Man's just like, I wish you and the X-Men all the luck in the world. And so ultimately, he's actually joined by Kyra herself, or Syra, or Syrah, or whatever, however you want to pronounce it. We'll pronounce it different times, different ways over the course of the video. But the thing about this is that she actually tells Peter, I have been watching you this entire time, and you're fascinating. Right, you went from being what is arguably the most hopeful hero to being the most melancholy hero. And she's like, I watch your city, right? I watch your people, and I watch my brother and those who foolishly take up your quest. I watch all of this. Now, there is a point where this actually leads, it kind of jumps back to the momentary fight between Juggernaut and the child of Cyttorak. And Juggernaut actually gets the upper hand, right? He forces the guy to yield. Now, there does seem to be a kind of caveat here in the sense that the Juggernaut makes this statement where he says the X-Men are now Earth's champions, right? Kind of taking the place of Spider-Man. So we don't necessarily know if within the covenant of Doctor Strange and Cyttorak, if that is an adequate stand-in for a champion, so long as someone takes up the mantle, or if that champion has to be decreed by the Sorcerer Supreme, whoever the Sorcerer Supreme may be. But it does stand to reason that if someone other than Doctor Strange can be Sorcerer Supreme and then designate a champion to protect the world and the Covenant stays intact, that someone other than the designated champion can become the new champion to fight on Earth's behalf. So again, it seems like it works, right, for the most part, because ultimately, like, this guy yields, and this leads to Calix stepping in and punching a hole through this champion, and then in turn, attacking the X-Men. Now, here's the crazy thing about this, is that this guy Calix, with this new power, right, basically soul rot, channeling the power of the Blight, literally brings the Juggernaut to a standstill like that. There's this point where the Juggernaut comes running up on him, right? And he's just like, all right, man, let's have this fight too, right? If this is another child of Cyttorak here, then let's have this fight. And ultimately, like, Calix just sticks his hand out and just stops the Juggernaut dead in his tracks with the greatest of effort. He's like, my father sees fit to bestow his gifts on everyone but me, but I have something better now. And just like sends the Juggernaut flying, which is amazing. You've only ever seen that a couple times in Marvel Comics. Back in the 90s, you saw Onslaught do it indirectly when he punched Juggernaut across the world. That was nuts. Or maybe it was just across North America. It was a huge punch, right? It was nuts. Juggernaut like lands on the grounds of like the X-Men Institute, and the X-Men are like, what in the world is going on here? And he's just like, Onslaught's coming, and it's just like, bro. And then you saw it with the Incredible Hulk becoming, the Horseman of War during the Peter David run, I'm pretty sure. It was really, really cool, right? It was just one of these cool things that happens where you see Juggernaut just get shut down from time to time. But then, like, Sarah starts crying and watching all of this, right? Because literally Calix just starts unleashing these hounds across the world. And she's just like, this is it, man. Like, my brother is officially gone. And that's where she kind of picks up where where Doctor Strange left off, and explaining things to Peter. That Peter's just sort of like, look, thanks for the cat, but like, if there's somewhere you need to be, like, I don't want to do any of this. And she's like, nope, I don't need to be anywhere. You do, right? Like, it's time for you to stop moping, home slice. Let's get back into it. So she just like snatches up Peter Parker and just like takes him outside. It's like, quit being a punk. Like, look at what's going on out here, right? And she's like, get it together. And so at that point, he's just like, wow, right? It's just this great big huge fight. And everyone here is dead, right? They're all dead. Like, these innocent people, well, maybe not everybody, the X-Men are still fighting, but like, these innocent people are all dead. And so at that point, it's like people he knows, right? People who were close friends. And so, of course, Phil Coulson appears. Now, for those of you guys who have not been following Marvel Comics well, maybe you have, but you haven't really been following Phil Coulson. Phil Coulson is now the new Death in Marvel Comics, mostly because Thanos basically took Mistress Death and turned her into an Infinity Stone. So she's not really around anymore. I mean, she is, but she's just like a ball hanging out with Thanos. And so, like, Phil Coulson is the new guy, right? Like, he's the guy that literally whisks people off to the afterlife, which is kind of a cool way to bring his character back, to be honest. And so one of the things that went on here, right, part of the bargain when it came to being Earth's champion during the Covenant of Cyttorak, is Peter Parker was given what were called reeds. And every time he died, he could cash in this reed, and this reed would bring him back from the land of the dead, right? Phil Coulson would literally resurrect him from death. And so at that point, Peter, seeing all these people here, he tells Phil Coulson, he's like, look, I will give you the last of my reeds, but bring them back and make sure they don't remember how they died. But Phil Coulson warns him. He says, look, man, if you do this, right, these reeds are how you return. If you hand these reeds over, if you die, there is no coming back. It's a permanent death. And so at that point, Peter's just like, that's a risk I'm willing to take. And he just hands the reeds over to Coulson and then jumps back into the fight again. Now, he does team up with the X-Men, and he does team up with Kyra. This is cool. And like, when this happens, initially they're like, okay, Kyra tells him there's something different here, right? It's not just my brother channeling the power of Cyttorak. He's channeled by something else. I've heard it called soul rot, the blight. I honestly don't know a whole lot about it. Not even Spider-Man knows that much about it. And I would even go so far as to say, outside of like his initial encounter with it, Doctor Strange probably doesn't even know that much about it. So it is very much an ambiguous force out there, and it can't just be defeated easily. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that Calix is incredibly powerful, he is a avatar of the Blight. So in the same way that like Null the symbiote god is an avatar or a facsimile of the cosmic entity Oblivion, it's not the same as being the cosmic entity Oblivion. And so basically Calix can be defeated. It's just a matter of figuring out how, because at this point he's crushed everybody, because in that moment he seizes control of Cyclops and he was like, you Earthers truly don't know when to give up. And so when that happens, this leads to Cyclops initially being thrown aside, jumping back into the fray with the rest of the X-Men, Juggernaut, and Spider-Man, and then going to face off against Calix. But nothing they do matters. And Spider-Man even channels this spell called the Infernal Spear of Ferrical, which, as Doctor Strange had explained to him, it was kind of a last-ditch effort spell. It will essentially destroy anybody that it's used against, even a scion of Cyttorak, a child of Cyttorak. But at the end of the day, it has no effect. And Calix tells him, you have not been paying attention. Scions are your superiors, and the Blight makes me their superior in every way. Literally, your spell's not powerful enough to work on me. And so in that moment, he just kind of like sends his hounds out there, and the hounds start attacking the various X-Men. And then Calix teleports away and destroys the hounds. But that's not really what was actually going on. The hounds were a transmission system, because at that moment, Cyclops attacks Juggernaut, and then the X-Men start attacking each other, and everybody in the city starts attacking each other. And that's where Kyra literally transports Spider-Man to a place in between dimensions, right? Where they're there, but they're not there. They're kind of out of phase with reality. So everything kind of looks, black and white and all that kind of stuff. But she's just like, so the dogs were a transmission system. Everybody out here is infected with a blight now, right? They're all going to destroy each other unless we find a way to defeat Calix. Everyone you know and love across the world is going to succumb to this, right? This is how soul rot works. It spreads from one person to the next. And so ultimately what you end up having her do is she says, okay, the only way for us to seemingly be able to pull this off, we have to recruit my father. We have to go to the Crimson Dimension. So they jump there, right, to where Cyttorak is, and all of her brothers and sisters are dead, right? Every single one of them were killed. All of them having been killed by Calix. And then at that point, Cyttorak's just kind of on the chair watching it all unfold. And at that moment, Kyra's almost kind of like disenchanted with her father. She was like, why did you allow him to do this, right? Like, why would he do this? Like, father's a warrior, right? He would fight infinitely against whatever odds. Now, that is one of the funny things about Marvel and the power of Cyttorak. Cyttorak's power has been provided to us and really shown to us in a variety of different ways. Juggernaut becoming a harbinger for Cyttorak's power, Colossus becoming the new Juggernaut in Marvel Comics, or at least he did for a period of time during Fear itself, and then a little while after Fear itself, that we've seen Doctor Strange channel the Crimson Bands of Cyttorak, right, in Marvel. And so we've seen like a variety of these little things here and there. But very rarely do you ever actually see Cyttorak as a demon entity pick up a sword and get into a fight. The closest that we ever saw to that was the 8th Day storyline and the story of the Octessence, the kind of battle between Cyttorak and the other 8 demon entities that at one point had a bargain on Earth to kind of create the most powerful avatar and so on and so forth. But the fact is, at the end of all of this, Kyra's like, okay, I'm gonna go after my brother. You need to figure out a way to like get Cyttorak out of what it is that he's doing right now. Right? Wake him up or kind of rally him, however it is that it needs to be done. Get this guy into the fight. And so what ends up happening is that as Spider-Man is trying to rouse Cyttorak from whatever's going on, a portal opens over his head and the Blight comes out. And here's the kind of crazy thing about this. Those of you guys who are fans of DC Comics and Green Lantern, it looks a lot like Parallax. It looks very, very similar to Parallax, the living embodiment of fear. And so when that happens, you suddenly have Calix, who appears behind Spider-Man. Now, Spider-Man's kind of musing to himself at that point. He says, how can we fight something so massive and so powerful? Like, this is beyond anything I could ever understand. And the response of Calix is, you don't. right? Know this with your last breath. My triumph will be complete. And he snaps the neck of Spider-Man and throws him on the ground. And just to kind of add a little bit of peppering on top, right? To verify this, Phil Coulson appears in front of Spider-Man and says, "You did your best, kid. It's time to go." Because Spider-Man is officially dead in Marvel Comics. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Do you think it's permanent? Do you think it's one of these things where Marvel's going to do it short term? Of course he's going to come back. Spider-Man's too popular to kill. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.